If I've not met you before, my name's Phil and I'm the pastor here, and I'm so glad that you've joined us. Also, a warm welcome to you if you've joined us, because you've joined us in the middle of our series in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus tells the story of how God's people were slaves in Egypt, how God saved them from slavery, and he saved them from slavery to worshipping him. And we've been going through that book together. Today, our talk is called You Must Be Holy to Meet a Holy God. And what we've seen is that God's big plan here in saving his people is he has a big plan to undo the curse of sin. We know that in the Bible, people turned away from God, and because of that, God cursed the world. And through Abraham and through his descendants, God is undoing that curse. And so that's why he saved his people out of Egypt from slavery to worship him, so that through them he could bless the whole world and undo the curse of sin. But what is sin? Well, sin is this sick selfishness. We all know it. It's a problem for our society. That's why they had slavery in Egypt. The inequality of our own society, the ugly tentacles of sin and death we experience at the level of a society. But also it's a problem for us personally. We experience the sin of others all the time, from that angry driver on the road to that selfish workmate or family member who makes you do all the work. But here, God has saved the Israelites out of slavery to sin to worship him, and to do more than that, to represent him to the world. They are to be a kingdom of priests, we hear today in our passage. And priests are the representatives of the gods. And so imagine you lived back in those days of the Israelites, and one of your Israelite neighbors says to themselves, "Oh, I wonder what that God, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites is like." How would you know what he was like? Well, look at his people and look at his law. Look at how just and fair they are. Look how God has changed their society and changed them personally as he undoes the curse of sin. And as you look at it, wow, it looks like the Garden of Eden again. If that's what God's people look like, then what must their God look like? The Israelites' neighbors are to say. And we've got to remember that the Israelites are an Old Testament picture of us. That God has saved us from slavery to sin and our own selfishness to worship him and to represent him to the world as a holy priesthood. And in 1 Peter 2:9, it talks about us and says we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that we might proclaim his excellencies. You see, we as Christians are to live and act as God's representatives or priests to the world. And when the world looks at us and the way God undoes the curse of sin for us in our love, in our selflessness, as individuals and as a community, as a church, people are to look at us and say, wow, what a God they must have. But are we ready to do this? Do we live our own lives, or as a church reflect our holy God? Because imagine the opposite. People that look at us and say, yuck, these Christians are just as selfish and as sinful as everyone else. Imagine what their God's like. And leave the Israelites, leave us aside for the moment. Let's come back to the Israelites. They're to be God's priests and representatives, but take a step back. Before the world can meet God in them, first they have to meet their holy God. Are they ready to take that first step of meeting God? Today's passage is a pivotal moment for the Israelites. They're saved out of slavery to worship God and represent him. But first they need to meet God, and they meet God at the special mountain, Mount Sinai. We're going to see that in 3 points today. We're going to see meeting a holy God. Secondly, we're going to see the lives and laws of God's holy people. And thirdly, we're going to ask the question, are we ready to meet and represent our holy God? Now, remember, the world is under the curse of sin because what happened? People didn't trust God. In the garden, Adam and Eve did not trust God. But God has a plan to undo the curse of sin, and to bless the world through his special people. And today we see the next big step in that plan. And it all happens over 3 days. In day 1, God explains the plan, and the Israelites agree to it. They agree to this covenant. And the plan is, on day 3, I'll come and meet you on the mountain, says God. And so day 2, they have a bit of a washing day. They get ready to meet God. They purify themselves. And then on day 3, they go to meet God as God meets them on the mountain. And as we'll see, the Israelites get a whole lot more than they bargained for when they meet God. Let's work our way through the passage. Day 1, God explains the plan. We get the setting in verses 1 to 2. They're at the place where God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, and they're exactly 3 months to the day since God saved them out of Egypt. Then in verses 3 to 6, God kind of lays out the agreement, the covenant with them. God calls Moses up the mountain and he says, go and explain the plan to the Israelites. And in verse 4, he reminds them, he says, you yourself saw what I did in Egypt, how I carried you out on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then throughout all nations you will be my treasured possession, though the whole earth is mine. What do we see? We see God reminds them that he's powerful, that he's saved them. And then we see in verse 5, if you keep the covenant and agreement, then you'll be my special people. He goes on to explain what it means to be the special people in verse 6. He says, you'll be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. There will be a kingdom of priests. This word kingdom, it only gets used of 2 kings in Exodus. First of Pharaoh, their old king, and then of their new king, God himself. They are a new kingdom with God as their king. And the mountain is a bit like his throne, and they've come to meet him. Next we see holy nation. Holy is a bit of a new word for them, but it means special, pure, set apart. A way I understand it is holy is the exact opposite of sin. It's a life of selflessness, beauty, not an ounce of muck. It's like being in the Garden of Eden again. In short, holy is God. God is holy. And they're going to hear a lot more about holy as they build a magnificent holy tent, a tabernacle. And it's going to look beautiful. It's blue, it's gold, it's jaw-dropping. It looks like the Garden of Eden again. But the plan is, when people look at them, they're not just going to look at this magnificent tent they build, they're going to look at the people themselves. The Israelites, they will be holy, radiant. People will go, wow. It's a bit like when you see a bunch of blokes and they're standing around and a beautiful classic car that's been restored drives past. And all of them, they stop their conversation. Their mouths open, it's shining in the sun because it's just been waxed, and they all go, wow, who owns that? And it's going to be the same with the Israelites. People will look at them and go, wow, who owns them? But it's important to notice the order here. They are saved first, and then they're made holy. Because if you remember one thing from today, remember this. Saved, then obey. It's saved, then the law. Notice the order matters because that's grace. And if we get it the other way around, well, that's works. And people think this all the time. People in the world, they think for Christians, oh no, you've got to obey God and then he'll save you, then he'll love you. Or that you've got to clean yourself up, you've got to make yourself holy, then God will like you. But no, that's completely the wrong way around. Take a look at the history. God didn't look down on the Israelites in slavery in Egypt and think, oh, what a great bunch of people. They'll keep the rules. They look very holy. No. We know that they were an awful bunch, weren't they? God saves them through the Red Sea, and then they get to Mount Sinai, not the other way around. The second thing to notice is that God says the whole earth is his in verse 5. He's not just the little God of one people. No, he's the big creator of everything and everyone. The whole world is his, but his purpose to save the world is through them. And God's keeping his promise to Abraham to bless the world through his family, to undo the curse of sin on a global scale. And it's going to be done through the Israelites. Well, as long as they can keep the covenant, that is. We get to verse 7 to 8. Moses comes down. He lays it out for them. The people say, yes. They say, this is great. A kingdom sounds good. We used to be nobody's slaves, but now we'll be a part of God's kingdom. We'll be priests, also good. The world will look to us. These Israelites, they must have thought all their Christmases had come at once. Their ancestor Abraham, he happened to be worshipping the powerful, conquering, creating God, and now they were going to be his special people. So we get to day 2. They start to have a bit of a washing day. They get ready to meet God, and they get ready by washing so that he can come and speak to them. He says that he's going to come down in a cloud, that they'll hear him speaking, because up to this point it's worth noticing they haven't actually heard God say anything. Everything's been said to them through Moses. But now they're going to meet God. No Moses, no middleman. And the point is that they will trust in Moses. And so God says, go to the people, consecrate them, and that means literally make them holy today and tomorrow on day 1 and day 2. Have them wash their clothes, and they'll be ready on the 3rd day, because that's when God's going to come. Now, why is it that they've got to have a bit of a washing day? Like, were they just dusty from traveling through the desert? No. This washing symbolizes holiness. Remember, holiness means no impurity, and so they need to be clean to meet God, to meet their king on day 3. They're also told to put limits around the mountain so that no one would come near. It's a little bit like a nuclear reactor. If you ever go to a nuclear reactor, there's all sorts of different layers of protection between you and the reactor. And so it's the same with God. You can't come too close to his holiness or you'll be irradiated. In fact, they're told don't even let the animals go near them. And if they do, don't touch them, throw rocks at them or arrows at them. Because they've touched that and they are irradiated and they will be dangerous to you too. It's like they're radioactive. And so they're told very specifically, wait for the horn to sound. When you hear the horn, then it's time to come up. It's a little bit like, when you go to the motor vehicle registry and you're waiting and that little ding, go to count of 5. It's a bit like that. When the horn sounds, ding, it's time to come up the mountain and meet God. But don't go up until then. Then in verses 14 to 15, they do everything that God says, which is a rare thing for the Israelites, but it's a good step. They follow what God says. And in 14 and 15, we're told specifically in 15 that they're not to have any sex. That sounds a bit odd to us, but we start to see how sexual practices were a big part of false god worship in those days. And we'll see a little bit more about that with the golden calf next week. You see, the gods were often associated with reproduction. If you wanted to have lots of lambs, lots of calves, lots of kids, well, you were somehow involved with the god in that through the worship. But here Moses specifically warns them. It's not that sex is wrong, God's invented it, but God's basically saying, I don't have sex. It's not bad, but he doesn't participate in it, and that you don't participate with him in that. God doesn't procreate, God creates purely through his word. So where are we up to? Day 1, they agree to meet God. Day 2, they get ready to meet God. Day 3, they go to meet God. And so there the Israelites are. They're all dolled up, they're nice and clean, and they're ready to meet God at the bottom of the mountain. But the truth is they aren't ready at all. What Moses writes down here, he's trying to explain to us what it was like when God came onto the mountain. And quite simply, it's terrifying, isn't it? It's holy, it's God. Verse 16, on the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain. Imagine the biggest storm you've ever seen, but bigger. thunder, lightning. Can you imagine the sound? You know when you hear the thunder clap and it goes kind of right through you. Imagine that. The kids would have been scared, the ringing in their ears. Because for them, the storm isn't up in the sky, is it? It's just there on the mountain. And look at verse 18. It's not just a storm, it's like a furnace or a volcano as well. But God is in the fire. There's smoke. It's not just like a storm, but a volcano as well. And then there's an earthquake, and the mountain trembles. And notice it says trembled violently. This isn't just a little shake or a tremor. This is a big shake. And then the mountain's not the only thing that's trembling. We're told in verse 16, everyone is physically trembling with fear. They are about to meet God, and then the trumpet blast. Remember, when the trumpet blasts, it's time to come up. And so the trumpet blasts, and Moses leads them out to meet God. They've come to meet God. They stand before their mountain. They see the cloud, the volcano, the sound, and the Israelites start to think to themselves, oh, we're not so sure about this. But then in 19, the trumpet blasts. It gets louder and louder and louder and louder. What's going to happen? 3 days ago, they were like, worship God, be a kingdom of priests. This sounds like a great idea. But now they stand before the raw majesty of God. And the trumpet is sounding, come up, come up, come up, come up. And they choke. They lose their nerve. What if we go up there? We'll be destroyed for sure, they think. What about you? Would you have gone up there? Would you have strolled up onto the volcano and said, "G'day, God, I'm holy enough for you"? No, that's right. If we were honest and if we all had any good sense, we would have been cowering in fear too. And the truth is that this is a picture of the last day. On the final day, we'll all stand before God in his raw, unfiltered holiness. And two things will be crystal clear. God is holy and we are not. And here Israel get a little taste of what everyone will see when we stand before a holy God. What will you do on that day? Well, you'll be completely lost for words. What can you say to a majesty like that? Well, Moses isn't lost for words. He speaks to God and God speaks back to him. And God says to Moses, come up. Tell the people not to come up to see the Lord or they'll perish. They know that God is holy and that they are not holy enough to see him. In fact, God even specifies in verse 22, don't let the priests come up. Yikes, they must have been thinking. Not even the priests, the representatives, are holy enough. And Moses says, yes, God, we know that you're too holy. You warned us. Hey, the Israelites finally listened, didn't they? I mean, the Israelites can be pretty unwise, but they're not unwise enough to step onto the volcano of God's holiness. You see, the Israelites, they're starting to get it, aren't they? They're starting to get who they're dealing with. Oh, a holy God. Oh, we are not holy. But how are they going to listen? How are they going to be with this holy God? They've already agreed to be his people. He's already saved them. It's too late to go back now. What do they need? They need a mediator. They're meant to be a kingdom of priests, mediating God to the world as God carries out his plan to save the world from the curse of sin. But they're going to need their own priests. They're going to need their own mediators to get near God. How are they meant to mediate God unless they have a mediator? And we see that Moses is their mediator. Notice that Moses, even though he's probably 80, he's scurrying up and down the mountain, being the mediator between them and the holy God. Moses is this go-between for them. But it's the same for us. One day we'll stand before the holy God and there's no way you can make yourself holy enough. You can wash your clothes with Nappy Sand Plus as much as you like and get them as clean as possible, but it's never enough for God. You can do the best that you can. I asked someone a while ago, I said, "Are you ready to meet God?" And you know what he told me? He said, "I've done a lot of good in my life. I think I'm ready to meet God." No matter what we do, it's still not enough. The Israelites could be pretty foolish, but they're not foolish enough to step into God's holy presence. Are you foolish enough to think that you can stand before God in all his holiness at the end of your life and that you'll be okay? No, you need a mediator. You need grace. Remember the order? We need to be saved first, then obey. That's how Israel are going to be God's representatives. But if they're going to do that, they have to meet God first. And what is it going to look like for them to be a holy people? Well, in the next step, God speaks to them, and he speaks about their lives and the laws of the holy people. We'll see that in our second point. Now, it's not all bad for the Israelites. Remember, trusting God, God is testing them and giving them an opportunity to trust him, and he's giving them a chance to keep the covenant. And finally, they keep one of God's instructions, don't they? God says, "Don't step onto the mountain into my presence, because if you do, you'll be destroyed." And they obey. Now, that wasn't a difficult command to keep, and now God's going to give them some laws. And this is often called the 10 Commandments. This is the terms of the covenant, the agreement. And it's a description of their holy lives, what they're meant to look like as holy people in a holy society. Remember, they're meant to represent God to the world, so what should they look like? And the 10 Commandments describe what they should look like. Now, we could probably do the 10 Commandments over 10 weeks, but today we're just going to look at the context of the Exodus story and how they fit in. Because it would be good for everyone everywhere to keep them, but they can't. And even the commandments are a result of God's grace and a part of God's initiative to show them grace. How are we going to sum them up? Well, in Mark 12, Jesus summarized the whole law in 2 ways. He says, love God and love people. Because at the end of the day, it's all about relationship. These rules are guides to relationship, how they're to relate to God and how they relate to each other. So we're going to split the 10 Commandments in along the same sort of lines. The first, loving God, specifically Yahweh, who saved you. And secondly, loving others, what it looks like to be the new and holy people. First, love God. They're told specifically to love and worship God. And in verse 2, he says, "I'm the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, so don't have any other gods before me." You see, here God's explaining who he is. He's the God who saved them. That's why they are to worship him. And remember, he saved them from slavery so that they can worship him. If they are to worship any other god, then that is to go back into slavery. Next, he says about taking his name seriously. He says not to make any idols. If they were to try and make any gods or idols like they have in Egypt, that would be sharing their worship with God. But to worship anyone else would be slavery, and God saved them from slavery to worship. We get God says he'll punish sin to the 3rd and 4th generation, but he loves to the 1000th generation and keeps his commandments. You see, God here, he's not mean, spirited in his jealousness. No, God has liberated them to worship him. And if they were to worship any other god, that would deny how good God is and deny what he had done for them. And we see God's love there, don't we? His commitment to them, that though he punishes to the 3rd and 4th generation, he shows love to the 1000th generation. He is just and he is powerful. And they're going to need this in their story as the Israelites, particularly when it comes to making idols, because this will be a problem for them. We also see they're not to misuse the name of the Lord. Lord there, that capital Lord means Yahweh. And that's important, wasn't it? God revealed his name to Moses and said who he was. But we saw Pharaoh. Pharaoh used God's name like it was a joke. And we saw what happened to Pharaoh, because God's name represents his holiness, his reputation. Then we hear about the Sabbath. Remember, the Israelites, they were workaholic slaves. That Pharaoh wouldn't give them a day off to worship. And now God saved them from Pharaoh and from themselves. Now they're not slaves to work 24 hours a day. Very quickly they would turn themselves and others into slaves. But notice here their whole society is to have a break, to stop and to worship. And we see God's equity here too, that even the servants and even those who live among them are to have a break as well. And we see this is all based on God's rhythm in how he made the world. The Sabbath, the day itself, is holy, a special day. Remember, holy means wow. And so when people look at the Israelites all taking a day off, even their servants, they look at them and think, wow, they must trust their God to provide for them, that they can even stop working. What a great and trustworthy God he must be. Then we see what the laws look like as how they are to love one another. And here we get the rules that people are often more familiar with, like don't murder, don't steal. And here it's to show God's justice. It's to undo the selfishness of sin and represent God to a watching world. And how they're meant to live with each other, it basically describes a utopia, doesn't it? It's selfishness of sin turned on its head, and it's a glorious picture. What God describes for them here in the Ten Commandments is a wonderful life. This is how humans should really live. This is what God saved them for. And you see, the design for the promised land is it's going to be like the Garden of Eden again, but now as a whole country. And it's worth saying, even the false gods of those days couldn't live up to these commandments. Even the false gods of those around them, they were always stealing or murdering. But here God says, even his people are going to live better lives than the gods of the other nations. Wow, how holy must their God be? So, how do they respond to hearing the very voice of God speaking to them? Well, they saw the thunder, they heard they heard the thunder and the lightning, the trumpet and the smoke, and they trembled in fear and they kept away. But notice, it's not the thunder and the lightning that they say to stop. They say, stop speaking, God. It's God's voice that was truly scary. Sometimes I hear people say, I want to hear God speak. No, like not in the Bible. I want to hear God speak to me from heaven. But is that what you really want? The Israelites hear God speak and they say, whoa, give us a mediator. They say in verse 19, you speak to us, Moses. We'll listen, but don't have God speak to us or we'll die. And Moses tells them, don't be afraid. God's come to test you, to keep you from sinning with this fear. And finally, they start to get some of the idea of God's power and they start to fear God. And God's testing them. He's giving them an opportunity to trust him so that when they're tempted to sin in the future, they'll remember this raw, unconstrained power and they'll think twice. But still, the people stay at a distance while Moses acts as their mediator. Moses approaches God in the thick darkness where he was. It's like Moses walks into the heart of the nuclear reactor for the sake of the people. But why does Moses approach God? He knows that God is holy, and Moses knows that he's not. But the difference is that he trusts God. You might remember that Moses had been at this mountain before. Moses had met with Yahweh in the burning bush. And he was filled with fear then, but God gave him a sign. God said to him, Moses, you'll be right back here on this mountain. All of Israel will be with you. You'll have saved them out of Egypt, and you'll worship me. And just like God said, Moses sees the power of God. and he knows firsthand that God is good and trustworthy, and so he approaches to speak for the people. But the people, they're not just going to need a mediator to speak to and from God. We're going to see that they're going to need a mediator to say sorry to God on their behalf. I don't want to give away next week, but next week they make the golden calf, and if you look at those commandments, they take out a whole lot of just the first ones, and when they do, they're going to need a mediator who will go and say sorry for their sin. You see, Israel, they tried to meet Yahweh, the holy God. They couldn't. They needed a mediator, and their mediator was Moses. But the question still remains, how are they going to do their job of representing God to the world as his holy priests? And what about us? How are we going to do our job of representing God to the world? Our third point, are we ready to meet and represent our holy God? Now, God's plan was to undo the curse of sin in the world. We saw in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, it looks back to Mount Sinai, and it remembers that and says, now that we are Christians, we are to represent God to the world. It says in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. So we now too are called to be holy. And remember, what's holy? It's the opposite of selfish. And so what do our holy lives look like? Well, the 10 Commandments are a pretty good example, aren't they? Remember how we summarize them? Love God and love other people. And so firstly, we are to stay faithful to the God who saved us, to take God's name seriously. We're to take a break from work because we are not slaves. And we're to trust God and not work all the time and worship him. We're to honor our parents. You know, just this week, I was talking to someone in our church who's having terrible trouble with his parents, but he's still trying to honor them as best as he can. That's holiness. We don't steal, we don't lie or covet what other people have and grumble all the time about what we don't have. No, we're a people who thank God for what he has given us, pure and blameless, without the pollution of sin. Remember, that's why they had their washing day, to represent that purity and holiness. We're to live such lives of love and purity that people say, wow, the world sees us and they should ask, who is their God? He must be amazing. Peter describes a bit more of this down in verse 12 from that. He says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles, that's those who aren't Christians, honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Peter says Christians should live such honorable lives that the world, or the Gentiles, will glorify God. And specifically on the last day when Jesus returns. Even though Christians are often spoken against for holy lives in our world, God is still glorified. But, there's always a but, isn't there? What about when we don't live holy lives? What about when people see Christians not living up to our own standards? Well, what does that say about God then? Well, it's less wow, isn't it? And more yuck. Let's make it more personal. What about us? Has this ever happened to you? Someone finds out you're a Christian and they're surprised. Oh, you're a Christian? You? And like me, maybe in that moment you think, oh, I haven't made God look good. And often that's why we try to keep quiet about being a Christian, right? I knew a friend of mine, and you know those little fish stickers that sometimes people put on their cars, the Christian fish stickers? He said, I'm such an aggressive and awful driver that I never want to put one of those in my car because I don't want to make Jesus look bad. But that's not the answer, is it? We don't need to keep quiet. We need to be changed. How can the world meet God with us when we're not even ready to meet God ourselves? And like the Israelites, we see two things, don't we? God is holy and we are not. But one day we'll stand before God in his perfect holiness. And Mount Sinai, it was just a warm-up. And that should fill us with fear and trembling. But what answer does God give the Israelites? Moses, a mediator who comes down the mountain. But for us, God comes down himself out of heaven, Jesus, our mediator. And in Hebrews 12, it reflects on Mount Sinai. And for the Christian, it says, actually, for us, it's not Mount Sinai, filled with the fear of God's holiness that we've come to. No, we've come to a different mountain, Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. And this isn't just imagery. Spiritually, we're there now. And it's not a place of terror, but of joy and rejoicing. Remember, God's holiness is, wow, something to be enjoyed. But how can we who are not holy enjoy him? It's because of our mediator, Jesus. He gives us a new covenant. And now before God, we are as holy as Jesus is. How can God see us as holy? Because we're washed. Remember, cleansed, washed by Jesus' blood. And see the last part of Hebrews, this passage, it says, Abel, he was the first person murdered in the Bible. Well, his blood from his unrighteous murder, it cried out to God, justice, justice. God, sow justice to these sinful people. God, you must punish unholy humanity. But Jesus' blood cries out, mercy, mercy. Don't punish because I have been punished in their place. And so on that final day, when you and I stand before God in his perfect holiness, there's nothing that we can do or say. But Jesus, he comes up beside us and he says, she's with me. He's with me, just as holy as I am, because I died for them. But what does this mean for us now? When we sin, when we stuff up before the world? You know, something happens at work or maybe with our friends, and before we know it, we've let fly from our mouth something, and we see the shocked look on their faces. And we think, oh, as a Christian, I shouldn't have said that. Because, and this is the surprising thing, when we don't represent God, we can still point people to God. We don't point them to ourselves, we point them to Jesus. Remember, we point ourselves to Jesus. We remember that God sees me as holy, that Jesus is my mediator. On the last day, I'll be truly holy, but it won't happen till then. And that even the Holy Spirit works in me now. And this incredible power gives us the power to be honest in that moment, to say, I'm sorry, I sinned, I stuffed up. We don't love our sin, but we don't lie about it. The second thing this does is that we point them to Jesus. We're honest, we're repentant. We can show God's holiness and grace even when we don't live up to it. Because after all, as Peter goes on to say, it's not about proclaiming our excellence, it's about proclaiming God's excellence, how he saved us, how we received mercy. So never underestimate the power of a Christian admitting they are wrong and saying sorry. People see this when we don't cover up our sin and they say, wow, you aren't crushed by your own failures, because we know that Jesus was crushed for our failures. And even particularly in our own unholiness, God's grace shines through. Let's pray. Father, we are so in awe of your holiness.